On the night Ethan and Grace finally confessed the love they had buried for years, it felt like the world had finally given them everything they had dreamed of. Their laughter turned into whispers, their whispers into promises, and for the first time, forever seemed possible. But just as their hearts began to beat as one, fate struck in a way that no one could have predicted. One moment of joy spiraled into chaos, leaving a silence that echoed louder than words. What followed would test the strength of love, memory, and loss in ways that break and bind the soul. The sun poured down on the small town of Riverbend, where the laughter of children still echoed through the same cracked pavements where Ethan and Grace had grown up. They had been inseparable since they were kids, two faces always seen together, two voices always carrying each other's secrets. Ethan was tall, quiet, and often lost in thought. Grace, on the other hand, had a smile that could soften even the hardest heart, and a boldness that always pushed Ethan out of his comfort zone. Through the years, people teased them, saying, "When are you two going to admit you're more than friends?" But they would laugh it off, pretending not to notice the way their hearts skipped when their hands brushed. Senior year arrived like a storm, filled with college applications, sports games, dances, and the sudden awareness that childhood was fading fast. And somewhere between the sleepless nights of studying and the whispered talks under the stars, Ethan and Grace began to feel a change. Ethan noticed how Grace's laughter lingered longer in his chest, how her absence felt like silence heavier than words. Grace noticed how Ethan's steady presence had become her anchor, how one smile from him could calm her storms. Yet neither dared to say it, afraid that speaking it aloud might shatter the fragile balance they had built over the years. But fate has a way of pushing what people fear. One night after a late study session at the library, Ethan walked Grace home. The air was cool, the sky painted with faint stars, and their steps slowed as they reached her porch. Their eyes locked, and for the first time silence. Ethan's chest tightened, his heart racing louder than his thoughts. He wanted to speak, but before he could answer, her phone buzzed with a call that would change everything. The days after that night grew heavier, the unspoken words between Ethan and Grace pulling them closer and yet apart. Grace's phone call had been from her father, reminding her that life wasn't as perfect as the warmth of Ethan's gaze. Her family was struggling, bills piling up, and her father's health fading. She felt torn between the joy of a new discovery with Ethan and the burden of holding her family together. Ethan, on the other hand, walked the hallways of their high school with a storm inside. He wanted to tell her everything, wanted to hold her hand in public, wanted to scream to the world that she was more than his best friend. She was the love he had been too blind to see all along. But fear of rejection, fear of ruining years of friendship, kept him silent. One evening, Grace skipped their usual walk home. Ethan waited under the old oak tree where they used to carve their initials as kids, but she never showed. He called her, only to hear her tired voice saying she had too much to handle. He could hear the weight in her tone, the way her laughter had dimmed. He wanted to run to her to help, but she pushed him away. At school, whispers began. Grace was seen crying in the bathroom, her eyes red, her smile absent. Ethan cornered her in the hallway, his voice. The days that followed felt like stolen moments of happiness. Ethan and Grace finally let themselves be honest, and it was like breathing for the first time. They held hands on their walks, they stayed up late talking about dreams. They kissed under the old oak tree where their names were carved. It felt like the universe had finally aligned for them. But shadows always lurked at the edge of light. Grace's father's condition grew worse, and hospital visits became part of her routine. She tried to balance school, her father's care, and her new relationship, but the weight of it all began to crush her spirit. Ethan stayed by her side, holding her through her tears, whispering promises he hoped he could keep. One night, while Grace sat in the hospital waiting room, Ethan surprised her with a small folded piece of paper. Inside was a sketch of the two of them under the oak tree, her smile wide, his hand in hers. Written beneath it were 4 words: "You are my home." Her heart swelled, her lips trembling as she kissed him. "Ethan, I don't deserve you." "Yes, you do," he replied, holding her tighter. "And I'm not going anywhere." But the storm outside was brewing faster than they realized. Grace's father passed away 2 weeks later, leaving her family shattered. The funeral was filled with sobs, and Grace clung to Ethan as though he was her last tether. The night of the senior dance arrived, a night everyone had been waiting for. The gym was filled with laughter, flashing lights, and music that made the air vibrate. Ethan and Grace walked in together, and for the first time in years, people stopped teasing and simply admired how perfect they looked side by side. Ethan wore a black suit that made his quiet confidence glow, while Grace wore a soft blue dress that caught the light with every step. They danced, laughed, and for a few hours, the heaviness of life disappeared. Ethan leaned close during a slow song, whispering, "I want this moment to last forever." Grace smiled, her head resting on his chest, whispering back, "Then let's make it last, even when forever feels short." Later that night, as Ethan drove Grace home, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. He parked under the oak tree, the same place where their love had bloomed. The night was calm, the stars above like silent witnesses. Ethan took her hand, looked into her eyes and said, "Grace, I love you, not just as my best friend, not just as my safe place. I love you with everything I am." Grace's breath caught, tears glistening in her eyes. "Ethan, I love you too. I think I always have." Their lips met in a kiss that sealed years of unspoken feelings. For a moment, nothing else mattered. But as Ethan drove off to finally take her home, headlights from a speeding truck blinded the road. The screech of tires tore through the night. Metal collided with metal. Then silence. The crash was loud enough to wake the neighborhood. Sirens filled the air, red and blue lights painting the night with chaos. Ethan's car was crushed against the guardrail, smoke rising from the wreck. Grace's cries echoed as paramedics pulled her from the passenger seat. She was bleeding, trembling, but alive. Ethan, however, lay still behind the wheel. On the night Ethan and Grace finally confessed the love they had buried for years, it felt like the world had finally given them everything they had dreamed of. Their laughter turned into whispers, their whispers into promises, and for the first time, forever seemed possible. But just as their hearts began to beat as one, fate struck in a way that no one could have predicted. One moment of joy spiraled into chaos, leaving a silence that echoed louder than words. What followed would test the strength of love, memory, and loss in ways that break and bind the soul.